G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. All of the negative effects that you know accrue to you from social media use, the algorithms that reinforce what you want to believe and demonize the things that you don't want to believe, the echo chambers that keep you liking and commenting and scrolling and clicking and sharing and arguing, the recommendations that are tailored just for an automaton like you to ingest into your algorithmic robot brain, the self-judgment that comes from overuse of social media, the anxiety, the bullying, the preying of perverts on underage users, that whole panoply, that universe, that mosaic of negative consequences that constitute the vast psychological experiment that is social media use in the 21st century. All those downsides may not be the regrettable side effects of the core product of connecting people. Those negative effects may actually be part of the core product, fundamental to its addictiveness, fundamental to its business model, and the people who run those social media companies know it. That is basically the conclusion to which today's guest came when she left Facebook and became a whistleblower. She collaborated with the Wall Street Journal a few years ago on a bombshell series of articles unveiling what Facebook knows about what it could do to prevent user harm and what it is failing to do. Mark Zuckerberg has been a busy little bunny on the witness stand in Washington, D.C. lately. You may have heard, amid all of the Trump chaos, that there is a big court case going on. The U.S. government is suing Meta under antitrust for allegedly maintaining a monopoly. It could reshape the future of social media, depending on which way the case goes. It's one of the most consequential antitrust cases in tech history. It'll impact privacy regulation. It'll impact big tech. It'll impact social media. And Frances, today's guest, started working at Google. She was probably working out at Google as well. You know, they have gyms on site. She worked at Yelp. She worked at Pinterest and ended up at Facebook as a product manager and a data engineer. And she herself helped to design some of the algorithms that initially figured out how to rank results, how to rank your feed, to put in front of you what is most likely to make you linger and share and like and click. She became disillusioned with that. And as I say, she made global news as a whistleblower. And I wanted to talk to her about, ever since having met her about a year ago when I was on a television panel show in Australia with her called Q&A. And in the green room afterwards, I said, you've got to get on the show. It's taken this long just to line up our schedules to discuss with her, in an ideal world, how would she advocate, in fact, how does she advocate with the nonprofit that she now works with, reforming social media to make it more humane in the most simple and achievable ways. Please enjoy this conversation with the one, the only, Frances Haugen.
There's still this kind of like grinding sense that the big tech companies are impossibly large and like we have no control and blah, 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 blah. But if you actually look at the details of how even Meta has changed over the last 4 years, it's pretty dramatic. Just a couple of days ago, they announced that they are going to now detect when under 18-year-olds are using their platforms and lying about their age by, like, for example, examining the content the kids post, which, they could have done a decade ago, but they chose not to because the service grows faster when, it just ignore you have 8-year-olds that are using your service.
And just to clarify, when you say analyze the content that they're posting, this has been a point that you've made for a long time, which is they say, well, we can't really verify people's ages. We have to take their word for it.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we would have to implement some kind of an internal police state requiring every user to provide ID. And that would be bad for whistleblowers and so on. And you've made the point that if you actually sat down with them and, you sat around a table and were like, okay, well, what are the 10 to 15 easiest things that we could do other than that to try to establish people's ages? They would easily come up with them. They just don't want to do those things. One of which would be track what young people are telling each other, because quite frequently a 10-year-old will say that they're 13 and then we'll jump on, and as soon as they've got their profile, we'll be talking to a bunch of other 10-year-olds about how they're 10.
Exactly.
So
a stat that I think most parents would be shocked by is even 2 years ago, so we can assume this number is probably worse now, even 2 years ago in 2022, I guess it's like 2.5, 30% of 7 to 9-year-olds were on some form of social media. Right. We are not talking about, should a 13-year-old, should a 14-year-old, should a 15-year-old be on social media? We need to be having a conversation of should a 7-year-old, should an 8-year-old, should a 5-year-old be on social media? And I think while we can have an honest intellectual conversation, and I feel actually quite conflicted on it. Like, I'm not a prohibitionist. I just want to see safer social media get built. I think most of us can agree that having 8-year-olds changing their behavior to get more likes and go viral is probably not developmentally appropriate for them.
Just while we're on the question of age gating, because I know this is a hot topic at the moment, and Australia is pretty aggressive,
particularly in Australia,
on this. Yeah, and thank goodness for it. Since I have 7-year-olds, and I want that gate closed as tightly as possible until they're 16. But the question of IDs, I've never quite understood why this is a potential human rights violation or terrible for whistleblowers. If you couldn't you just have an exemption where if you don't want to upload an ID, you can just send an email and they'll allow you to create an anonymous account, but at least the additional bit of friction would probably discourage a lot of underage people from doing so?
I think IDs are one of these things where there's a lot of potential ways that it goes just badly. Like, we assume perfect competence. We assume people following the rules. And that just can't be counted on for the wide number of social media platforms that exist. Like, there isn't one or two or three forms of social media.
So when you think about the way that IDs are handled in high-tech, in well-functioning high-tech places like Australia and Scandinavia and places where, like, when you're applying as a US citizen to come to Australia and to get the visa waiver, you can now, like, just hold your passport over your smartphone and it knows what it is and it detects all the information. There's like facial recognition stuff. There's like, there are heaps of examples where I need to verify my identity for some organization that is collaborative with my state, like the state government, for example, whether that's like the equivalent of the DMV or something like that, or Medicare or something. And there'll be a third-party app which has two-factor authentication and stuff, and so you don't need to give up your own sensitive information to the entity itself, but you outsource that. Couldn't you have a collaborative central social media clearinghouse that just verifies people's ages in as anonymous and secure a way as possible and then gives them a tick of approval or not, depending on what age they are?
So I think you could hypothetically do, like, so they often talk about this concept of zero knowledge proofs, where you have an outside organization, you have some kind of credibility or credential that you can carry on the internet without disclosing, who your fundamental identity is. Because, like, I think one of the things that sometimes gets taken for granted particularly in Australia, is like not all places are equally functional. And that systems that when they're put in place often get used for counter purposes in places that are less functional. Right. But before we get too far, I think one of the key things to also talk about is I think IDs are a distraction. Like, people respond really emotionally when we start talking about IDs because there are these kind of implications of, the state is watching over me or whatever. I think the important question to ask is, what extra do we actually get versus, say, looking at people's faces when they sign up, looking at the content they engage with, looking at simple things like how fast do they type? Can they spell? How do they hold their phone? I watched an interview with a kid, with a number of kids about Roblox and labor exploitation, which I think is a fascinating topic. You have this $10 billion company that was built on the backs of child labor, like kids writing games, and then having very, very unequal rules around monetizing those compared to, say, YouTube or or TikTok. But they interviewed this kid as part of that documentary, and the journalist had just spent a few minutes talking to his kid about how passionate he is about running his business where he makes these video games and makes $100 a month or something. And she's like, is there anything you don't like about this platform? And this little 10-year-old, without missing a beat, goes, I hate it when creepy adults talk to me. And she was startled, right? Because in Roblox, everyone is like a cartoon. Like, how do you know you're talking to a creepy adult, right? You can't show your face even if you wanted to show your face. And he's like, they type so fast. Right? Like we have all these things where, maybe adding IDs would get 0.1% more precision than we currently have. But if it means that we don't act because people get scared and the platforms use it to fearmonger, like we just don't need to use those tools.
Okay. So yes, and of course, I'm speaking, now that you say that, I realize that I'm speaking in such an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy way in an era of AI to think that you would need a physical, identification card that has the stamp of approval of some kind of authority. I feel like my grandmother carrying papers around war-torn Europe or something and showing papers. Obviously, AI is going to have more sophisticated ways of sorting out the characteristics of people who are 10 versus people who are 18. But we have gotten sidetracked by the youth thing, because I am more interested in just your general snapshot. I mean, this is a vast psychological experiment that all of us are going through, not just young people, right? And I don't know whether or not we're on a better or worse trajectory than we might have worried that we would be 10 years ago. So let's just start there. Like, how would you?
Sure.
In other words, this is a problem that I think we all are aware of, but it's hard for us to articulate exactly what the problem is. But you spend your life articulating what the problem is. So can you define for us what the problem is?
I would say at a really basic level, it's that a handful of corporations, and one is an outlier of badness in this way, which is Meta, because it's run by one person. We have these handful of corporations they're pretty fundamentally unaccountable to the countries they operate in. You know, they've done a wonderful job of sowing complete chaos within the government in the United States, to the point where even with 60 co-sponsors, we couldn't get our kids' safety law passed last year. Right. You know, I would say we probably have a much more toxic environment than even Australia does. And it doesn't matter because they've sowed so much FUD around it. But when we move to, like, I think that an important question. So there's two things. So one is that question of unaccountability. These corporations that don't really have any checks and balances on them. We have no right to even basic transparency anymore, because they shut down the few little windows that we had into these platforms over the course of the last couple of years. That combined with the fact that they really intimately impact all of our lives. Like, even if you yourself don't use social media, you interact with people every day who do use social media and potentially spend a lot of time on it. You only need 3% of a population on the streets to have a revolution. If you have systems where people aren't picking out what you focus on, but AIs are picking out, you get into a situation where people can get pulled down these rabbit holes where they keep seeing more and more reinforcing content that's about an eating disorder, that's about paranoia about the government, that's about racial hatred. And it's one of these challenges where, when we have no accountability, we have no ability to see if the problem's getting worse or like what is the level of severity, which means we don't actually get to choose to use these products. It's a really serious situation.
And just to channel the inevitable concerns or pushbacks of conservatives when they hear you articulate the problem in that way, I would also remain alert to the fact that the echo chamber effect is not just at the 3% of the extremes, but we are all in an ambient, I guess there's a ring of concentric circles, right, of greater or lesser influence and capture by our own echo chambers.
100%.
And thus there become blind spots that, including in the media, where, as you may have seen during COVID, for example, or over the trans debate, there'll be consensuses that develop as a result of the soup that you're swimming in, the kind of social media that you're consuming, the kinds of penalties for being a dissenter from a mainstream orthodoxy that conspire to limit your thinking and make you perhaps more censorious or, more blinded to other points of view. And certainly the left was vulnerable to that over the past 5 years as well.
100%. Yeah. But I think one of the ways to think about it a little bit is, even very, very basic things which would allow people to consent to what they're using, right? Like, if you don't have informed consent, you're not actually consenting. It's things as basic as we have no guarantee. When people say things like, can we see every post that was seen more than 100,000 times in the United States, right? Like, none of those posts violate anyone's privacy, right? If 100,000 people see something, that's not private. They turn around and they play things like the privacy card. They say, we can't do that because it would violate people's privacy. And so it's one of these questions of, if you don't get to see what echo chambers exist in society, so you don't get to decide how to govern systems like this, you don't get to see what echo chambers you're in, though we are a little bit better than we were 4 years ago, right? So 4 years ago, I started talking about the right to reset. that you should have the right to reset any algorithm that you interact with and go back to whatever is the default that they start with. Because people notice when they start going down rabbit holes often. It's not just a thing where people have no idea what's going on. For the first time, that got introduced into Instagram a couple months ago. It's not super obvious. You have to know how to navigate the menu, but you do have a right to reset today. Imagine if we had that on more platforms, or if you got warned if you started sliding down a rabbit hole. Those are real changes that we can make and not censor anyone.
So, I mean, the right to reset sounds good, but it's not the right to opt out of an algorithmic curation of content, right? I mean, I think this whole question about whether or not a company like Facebook or Meta is a publisher, or whether it is just I suppose, a clearinghouse through which other individuals are capable of contacting each other, is sort of belied by the fact that obviously they're putting their finger on the scales of certain types of content and not on other types of content. It's not like when Facebook started out and it was just a reverse chronological feed of all the things that the people you follow had been posting. Now it intentionally elevates some things and intentionally demotes other things. And it's all very well to say, well, I want to reset so that I no longer see quite so many skinny women with big boobs. But it's not going to take very long after resetting for it to notice that I spend more time hovering over images of skinny women with big boobs, or whatever it might be, chocolate cake, than I do over charts of national debt levels during the Greek financial crisis. And so isn't the actual solution to provide a restructuring or an option for restructuring social media such that there isn't a constant algorithmic feedback loop that is burrowing me into whatever rabbit hole happens to be the most attention capturing?
So I think one of this is like a kind of a root thing in terms of figuring out what is the path forward, is how do you set a system of rules or incentives that gets the outcome that we want, right? And I think one of the things that we can all agree on is that we would like to give consumers genuine choices. And in the case of what you described, like, I want to have social networks where I only hear from the people that I choose to hear from. Right? I don't want you to push me into mega groups with hundreds of thousands of members so that my feed is always full. Like, I don't want the algorithm to be so hyper personalized and tuned. Like, I want to get an ambient sense of like what other people are being exposed to. You need to take a step back and say, like, well, right now, what are the incentives that cause these products to become what they are? And I think one of the core ones, and this is to quote, and probably the other biggest whistleblower, I should know, Sarah Wynne Williams has come out. I used to say Arturo Bejar was the largest other whistleblower from Facebook. But that's not true, because Sarah has done a great job. So I would say, Arturo Bejar, who was the big whistleblower about 2 years ago, he came forward and said, I did a bunch of really in-depth work polling children, right? Asking children about their experiences on Facebook, asked hundreds of thousands of kids in the United States. And what they found was that 1 in 8 girls between the ages of 13 and 15, which really means all the way down to those 7-year-olds, just to be super honest. 1 in 8 girls between 13 and 15 said they received an unwanted sexual message in the last 7 days, in the last week. 1 in 8. And he said in front of the Senate, if we want that number to go down, the only way it's going to go down is if Mark Zuckerberg has to report it next to his profit and loss numbers each quarter. And I think there is a basket of simple metrics. You can't play the privacy card here and say, oh, people's privacy is being violated. We can't tell you anything about the platform. I think there's a basket of metrics. There are things like when you poll users, this could be kids, this could be adults, there's various ways we can structure this, and ask them the question, I control my usage of the platform. I feel in control of how much I use the platform. I can stop whenever I want to. Or if I say, does this interfere with your ability to go to bed when you want to? Do you say yes? If you start to have to report metrics like that, you will start to push products away from being so addictive and so hyper-tuned. Because the only way you make those numbers go down is by, giving people more control, giving them a little bit more of the Greek debt crisis, and a little bit less of, whatever their most vulnerable foible is.
I mean, that strikes me as being a little bit like a gigantic company is producing toxins that contaminate everybody, and your solution to it, instead of addressing the production of toxins, is to force them to report in their annual reports about how many toxins they're releasing. Like, it's better than nothing.
And quantity.
But right, it's better than nothing, but wouldn't it be better to address the toxins themselves, in the sense of like addressing?
So the challenge. So it's interesting. Like I love your analogy. I think it's very germane, right? Like there's this question of like, in lots of other arenas, we have really basic bright lines. Like we have ways of distinguishing, is this good or is this bad? What's so different about technology? What's so different about social media? And the thing that we have seen time and time again is, if you write a law and you describe a thing, and even if you describe it very precisely, the companies go and make a slightly different thing and say, this is no longer the same thing. It's very, very hard. So for example, are you going to ban all personalization? People like the personalization on Netflix. People love that. I'd say even on YouTube, like YouTube has a much less people are reporting, I've been damaged by YouTube, compared to saying I've been damaged by Instagram or damaged by TikTok. It's really difficult to come in and say with a blanket, like, oh, you can't do this anymore.
No, I mean, I don't. Yes, but somewhere between the bludgeon of you can't do this at all and the feather duster of tell us how bad it is,
totally.
And hopefully be shamed.
So I think there is an in between.
Yeah.
So I think one of the interesting questions that's happening right now with Section 230. So I've heard rumor. I think this is incredibly dangerous. I don't support it at all. I've heard a rumor that certain people in the Senate are saying, "Hey, we should just sunset 230. We should say 3 years from now." So for context, so I like to apologize to Australia. I like to apologize to the world.
It's my duty as a journalist to ask silly questions, because lots of people don't follow this.
Yeah, no, it's not a silly question. It's very important. So way back in 1996, we used to have these things called bulletin boards. And a bulletin board is kind of what it sounds like. Bulletin boards like that cork board thing, and you put a little pin in it and other people can read stuff that you pin to the bulletin board. Bulletin boards were basically like chronological feeds where there'd be different conversation topics, and you'd just post a thing in and it would fall into that flow, that chronology of whatever that topic was. Not very stimulating, but people loved them. People spent all their time on them back in 1996. But this problem arose on two sides. So on one side, there was one of these bulletin boards, and they didn't do anything. And someone said something disparaging about a company that was not true, and sued the bulletin board for hosting it. And the courts ruled, because they weren't doing anything, they were like a neutral conduit. They weren't a publisher. They weren't responsible for what people are saying. But a different court case came out that was almost identical, only this platform did take a certain amount of proactive action. They went in there and they removed, pornography. They removed a few other things. And the court said, hey, because you are going in there and curating that experience, you've taken responsibility. You are a publisher. So this very unfortunate situation arose where companies that were trying to create higher quality experiences were being fined, were being punished, and companies that were reckless and doing nothing were viewed as like, oh, then you have no responsibility. So Congress stepped in and said, hey, you have the right to curate without giving up this safe harbor position. And for publishers in general, or the service providers in general, if you are providing a space for people to speak on the internet, you are not responsible for the content that those people produce. So fast forward in time, and we get into a very, very different world. So instead of having everything you see be picked out by other humans in your community, even if that community is a digital community, and the order is just, you are the one acquiring information. You are hunting down and learning things. We move into a world where these things called recommendation feeds appear. And it's quite late. It's like 20 years, close to 20 years. It's like 2011 is when like the first algorithmic feed shows up in Facebook. And it takes another like 5 years for Twitter to follow.
Did Facebook pioneer that, by the way, Frances?
Ooh. I think Netflix had an algorithmic feed at that point. So I don't think we can purely say that they were the first. Oh, no. So the first commercially used recommender system was on Amazon. Okay. I went and looked up all this. So the first one was like, so it was like,
if you bought this, you might also like this toothbrush.
You might
okay. But Facebook was the first social media platform to introduce, to start fucking around with what what gets to go at the top and what gets to go at the bottom.
And I think one of the ways to think about this, and I want to be clear, I am partially responsible for the world that we live in today, because I worked at Pinterest and I was the product manager who picked out what you saw on Pinterest. And one of the things that Pinterest saw, and this is the same arc that took place on Facebook. It basically is a very similar arc to anywhere that chooses to go down the algorithmic direction, is they started out with a network where you chose who you received content from. They found that people didn't consume enough, that it was too hard to go and build out a community to hear from. So they started giving you topics. Topics are kind of a little bit like groups. They give you chunkier things where you'd say, you like cooking. Now you are going to we'll always know we can fill your feed with cooking stuff. And then they went one step further and said, we now understand the significance, like the meaning of this content better. We know that you don't just like cooking. You like vegan cooking. You like gluten-free cooking. We're going to give you specifically that. And the challenge is that as we move from humans to computers, we say, hey, we want you to consume more. And so we are going to figure out using computers how to make sure we always are showing you things. You never are going to get bored. You also get into a zone where those computers don't actually know what they're showing you. And they don't understand significance. They don't understand the idea that often our greatest vulnerabilities are the things that we're drawn to. And so we end up in this place where, Section 230 is now being applied to those algorithms. So before, it was this question of, well, if we provide a space at all for people to post content, we have to give immunity to the people who are providing that space, because there's no way to ensure that never anything gets through. But the flip side now is, what matters more than any given piece of content is that content selection system. And right now, there are no consequences for optimizing that system to be harmful to you other than the risk that you may leave.
Right. And so just to make a few analogies here, because this is obviously a hybrid space, which is neither a newfangled kind of newspaper nor an old-fashioned phone service, right? Because I hear all these analogies being made. Well, the internet is just like a phone service, right? So it's like a utility, essentially.
It's a series of tubes.
Facebook. It's a series of tubes, as the Republican senator famously said.
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
Obviously, if there were no algorithm in the room, if I was just receiving the posts that my friends and businesses that I follow had been posting in a reverse chronological order, then that would be true. That would be akin to a phone company being held liable for the conversations that I have, on the telephone.
Totally.
That would be unfair. On the other hand, if it is more like a newspaper where it's choosing what to show me and what not to show me, even if it's
in what
not,
order?
Yeah, and in what order? Even if it's not writing the articles itself, let's suppose it's a news aggregator service or something like that, Apple News or the Associated Press or something, where it's taking in content from other people and then arranging them. Then obviously it does have a responsibility to be held accountable for the kinds of things that it's showing me and any deleterious consequences they might have. It's interesting that you point out the existence of the human versus non-human, because when you mentioned Netflix, that got me thinking. As you say, we do want a certain amount of curation. Like, one of the great clever tricks of Netflix was in the early days to identify what productions it should greenlight on the basis of user behavior.
100%.
House of Cards
100%.
comes about because they noticed that people who watch Kevin Spacey movies also watch David Fincher movies and also like British political crime shows. And so they buy the rights to a British political crime show, and they get David Fincher to direct it, and they get Kevin Spacey to star in it, and you end up with a great product that tickles the likes of me. Where are we? Like, I am sympathetic to the anti-social media argument that says that as long as there is an algorithm involved in the loop, you are a publisher because you control the algorithm. But it sounds like you're not crazy about abolishing Section 230, which seems to me to be a logical consequence or conclusion of that.
I wouldn't agree. I wouldn't say
instinct.
that that's my position.
Okay.
I think my position is not that we should rip the Band-Aid off and say we're going to sunset it in 3 years, because we are in a position right now where we're very bad at passing laws. Right, like we pass progressively less laws every year. Like every new session of Congress, we pass less laws than the one before it, and it's to the point where, like, we don't really like do budgets well. Like we end up like a year behind on passing the budget because like we can't even agree on that. Like
then you threaten to drive the government off a cliff and have the United States default on its debt, and then everyone comes together.
Yeah, we're classy like that
at the last minute, and
the first time I went to Australia to talk with like your representatives, like I got to go to Canberra, I got to meet all these interesting people. It was while we didn't have a Speaker of the House.
Oh wow!
And I kept being asked, like, so why are you in Australia? And I'd have to be like, well, we haven't had a Speaker of the House for 11 days. That hasn't happened since 1860. Like we're going through a phase. Hopefully it won't last forever. We'll see how it goes.
I feel for you. I feel for you. Also, can I just say, we're about to have a federal election in less than 2 weeks. And I've never felt more grateful to live in such a boring country, because you have these two very boring, grey-faced, middle-aged, bureaucratic men fighting about basically nothing. And I'm like, thank goodness for boring politics. Anyway, carry on.
To flatter all the Australians, my husband and I have had conversations about like where would we live in the world if we didn't live in Puerto Rico, and we would probably. I hate to pick a team. We'd probably live in Melbourne.
Yeah, go for it. I love Melbourne.
It's delightful.
Yeah, it's rainy.
But to finish the thought, so this question is, okay, so if Section 230 is flawed, if like literally we've gone to the point where, for context, 44 U.S. states have sued Meta saying, hey, you straight up lied about hurting kids. Like you knew you were hurting kids. You were like, let's just drive this bus off the cliff. No one's going to catch us. When they went to the courts, Section 230 is so flawed that the judge said, hey, you don't have a case because it's not illegal to intentionally harm children, like knowingly intentionally harm children under Section 230. Right? Like that's where we've gotten to. So if Section 230 is so flawed, like what should we do with it? Because that's the real issue. The issue is there's the world without Section 230 the internet will break, right? Like you cannot run the internet as it currently is. So what's the alternative? And the thing that I've been suggesting, and this will potentially make your blood boil because it does let the tech companies a little bit off the hook, is I think they should have to, like, for some specified set of harms, right? We have to actually structure a little bit more than the Europeans did, even though I love that the Europeans just said, if you know there's a harm, you got to deal with it. You got to tell us about it. I think for some set of harms, and we need a process for how we add harms over time, but for some set of harms, maybe start with 5 or 10, the companies have to disclose enough data, and we can have a conversation, even say what some of that initial data should be, enough data that we can tell the magnitude of the problem, and they should have to disclose what they're doing to make that problem less bad. And if they do those two things, and they give us ways to substantiate that they are actually executing that plan. Remember, we're not specifying the plan, they're specifying the plan. And set some kind of sense of you must be making progress or we will rule you in contempt. Give them safe harbor for those specific harms. Because right now, our situation is we have no right to any data. And so questions like, does this interfere with your sleep? A third of kids in the United States a third of high schoolers are on screens till midnight or later most school nights, which means probably 10 or 20% are on till 2, right? Like we have so little data that we don't have the right to know what fraction of the population says, I have trouble going to bed because of this application.
Why can't we poll them independently? Why do we need the consent of the social media companies?
I think that's a great idea. Like, I think it's that is definitely a thing where there's value in doing more large scale polling. I strongly encourage people who have funding sources for that or, an appropriate statistics background. But I think one of the key challenges there is in the United States, we've actually really struggled with polling in the modern era, as you might have noticed from our presidential figures, because the ways of accessing people has gone actually quite hard.
Right.
So I do strongly support that, but we have to figure out funding sources for
right. And I guess if you put it inside the app, if you coerce the social media companies to comply, and there was a pop-up, inviting people to take part in a 20-second survey once every few weeks, then that would probably be a more effective way than trying to call them on a landline during dinner and asking to speak to a 13-year-old member of the household.
And that's the other thing too, is like, how do you contact an 8-year-old?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Other than through the app.
And just before we leave Section 230, I hear this as an article of faith from people I trust who know a lot about tech, that it would be disastrous for the internet to abolish Section 230. The whole edifice would collapse. Just bear with me for a second, since we're in a moment of U.S. government that is playing with devaluing the dollar and erecting, and turning its back on on NATO and the global financial system.
And kidnapping people.
And kidnapping people. Like, if we're in the...
Let's not mince words.
Yeah. So if we're in the blue sky zone of like everything is possible and none of our previous assumptions can be held as givens, why is it a given that the internet, the way that social media currently conceives of it, has to remain? Like, if you abolish Section 230 and all of a sudden they can't have the algorithms that they have without being accountable, and they get deluged by lawsuits from private citizens and they have to change the algorithm, why would that not just be similar to when Ralph Nader forced car companies to introduce seatbelts, and they were like, well, we can't, there's no way, you can't put a seatbelt on every single car, or the expectation that we have of McDonald's that not a single McDonald's hamburger anywhere in the world should make somebody sick. You can imagine if we lived in a world where McDonald's hamburgers made people sick all the time, McDonald's would say, you can't pass a law. There are billions and billions of burgers. How can we possibly, it's going to change the whole... Well, yeah, maybe it just has to change. Maybe the whole thing just has to be burned down the way that it is, and they'll find a way to deal with consequences.
I feel like I like to think that my job has two planks to it. So one is to give people hope that things can change, because they actually have changed much in the last 4 years as a result of the kind of pressure that we're putting on the platforms now. But it's to also remind people that there are things we want technology to be able to do that technology is likely never going to be able to do. At least not in a way that we would want it to be executed. I'll give you an example. So some of the things that right now would go into effect if Section 230 went away is, like, for example, right now, if you are seen as promoting terrorism, like, you are liable, right? And that's actually a thing that is true. That is for systems that aren't like social media platforms. That's true on the internet today. What is terrorism? Right. In the case of the Luigi Mangione shooting, that's where a guy went and assassinated the CEO of United Healthcare. It's like the largest healthcare company in the United States. He never put out a manifesto. He never, like, the manifesto that was released, the cops released it. He didn't release it. He killed one person. Like, there's not really a basis to say that he's a terrorist, but he's being charged with terrorism. There's a lot of different things where this administration particularly would come out and say, these protesters aren't protesters, they're terrorists because they broke these windows or they scared people. And as soon as you start having fuzzy lines, now we need to go to the platforms and say, you need to go find all the people who potentially are dangerous, because you're now liable for it. And when that happens, like, one of the core, the reasons why I always am coming back on, we want to have metrics. We want to see improvement in metrics. There's a lot of different ways to get from point A to point B when it comes to tech. Lots of different ways we can do this. The reason why I don't say you need to take down every act of hate speech is because computers don't understand what we're saying, right? There's a huge amounts of gray lines. And you end up being in the situation where if you want to guarantee you get every last piece of hate speech or every last piece of terrorism content, you will take down huge swaths of totally innocent content.
Okay.
Because the computer's not exactly sure.
Okay. I mean, all right, you've won me over on that point. Let me try to see if I can split it apart and split hairs here. Suppose you...
I welcome it.
Suppose you retained immunity for the social media companies from state prosecution, right? Either at a federal or a state level. So you can't go after them for terrorism content. You can't go after them for hate speech or whatever. But you make them, for the first time, become civilly liable to lawsuits from individuals who claim that they've been harmed by being sent down a rabbit hole because their daughter was looking for dieting tips and ended up consuming lots of anorexia content, for example. So they have more of a responsibility or more of a duty of care towards their users, but you're not opening the door for them to be hounded by the authorities. Would that assuage your concerns there?
I think there's an opportunity to go in and pick categories of harm. And this is one of the places where it gets really contentious in the United States, is if we were to sit down and find where the overlap is. Like the place that I think is possible to start is kids, or like coming in there and saying, like, there are categories of known harms. Like one of the projects that my nonprofit is working on is we've made a taxonomy of harms in kids, and we have about 40 discrete harms that have at least some evidence. There's a huge range. Some of them are very, very meticulously researched. Some are more conversations that are just becoming prominent, things like labor exploitation. The first laws in the United States around making money off your kids on social media are just being passed now. I think you can go in there and say, let's try it out, right? Like, let's try it out for eating disorders. Let's try it out for depression. Let's try it out for sleep deprivation or impacts on schools. But the challenge there, again, I think the path that actually is going to like let you get there, or like what would be the remedy from the court, is things like saying, let's go and agree to some metrics. Let's make sure you are actually asking children and adults on what their experiences are. Because to quote Arturo again, when it comes to things like unwanted sexual imagery, Facebook was saying there was basically no unwanted sexual imagery being distributed. And when you ask kids, lots of them said, this is what my experience is online. And so it's one of these questions of, we need to change the process of how we create technology, and we need to change the way that we watch how that technology is being developed, because It's been basically acting in a vacuum up until now.
One thing that occurs to me as a potential entry point that's between the bludgeon we were talking about earlier of banning algorithms or banning personalization on the one hand versus the light feather of mere transparency on the other would be to change the business model of social media companies. Some people
love that.
play with the question of, if the only metric at the moment is the amount of time that you spend on the website. I mean, these are free platforms, which means they have to deal in your attention and sell it to advertisers. Is there a way of, so that you don't have to go around and play a game of whack-a-mole where you're trying to fix all of these problems that are emerging from a single cause, which is that they have to hold your attention as long as possible and therefore make their products as addictive and radicalizing as possible, so that they're sexy? Could you do that? Could you basically say, like, okay, you're no longer going to be driven by time on site as the metric. Now it's going to be X, or you have to have, I don't know, a paid system. I mean, what's possible?
So one of the things when I'm feeling more mischievous, the thing that I always try to get people to just imagine if we did this, is, back when I was working at Pinterest, so I had a job very similar to what exists at Facebook. We were tweaking the algorithms, how much time we could get you to spend on the site, how many ads we could get you to click on. This was maybe 2016, 2017. A more innocent time on it. And back when we thought Facebook could change the world in positive ways. We pushed out a single change. This is just one change. We came in and said, hey, one of the challenges of picking content with computers is computers don't understand the concept of boredom, right? So if I'm picking out content and I'm like, I want to give you the thing you're most likely to save next on Pinterest, I'm going to give you a thing as identical to the last thing you did. So, for example, if you pin a daisy, like a pillow with a daisy on it, I'm going to find all the white flowers I can for you, like all the pillows with white flowers. But the problem when you do that is people get bored. And so we went in there and we made a relatively simple model where we put all the content in the world into 6,000 buckets, not a ton of buckets given how complex the world is. But we went in there and said, hey, we're going to make sure we sprinkle content from different buckets in your feed. You're not going to get deluged in any given thing. And that one change increased global consumption by 6%. And for context, we had 300 million users globally.
What's global
I sucked up
metric,
lifetimes.
what does that metric mean in the context of Pinterest?
It means how many pins did you look at? Okay. People spent 6% more time. Like we took whole lifetimes away from people from one change, right? But the interesting thing was, while people looked at 6% more pins, Pinterest only made about 2.5%, 3% more revenue. So you can say, how did that happen? Like, if you're looking at more content, like I thought we had this direct relationship. Like, you look at content, I get to show you ads, I get money. So why did Pinterest not make 6% more money? And it's because the people who we impacted the most were people who were already consuming a lot of content. Like, the most profitable second you spend on a social network is the first second you're there, right? First minute you're there. The longer you're on there, each incremental minute, the platform makes less and less money from you because they show you all of the ads they think you're going to most likely click on right up front. Like, all their best ads are going to go right up in front. And so there's this interesting question of, if they make progressively less and less money off you, and we know that harm is at least partially correlated with people who get sucked into these platforms really intensely, what if you went in there and said, hey, there's some sin tax. We're going to tax you at a certain rate for amount of content consumed. We're going to base it on whatever your platform is, and basically make it such that if you have this person who is beyond some cutoff, you stop making money off them after they've been on there for an hour or 2 hours, something like that. And use that money to fund in-person community. That's community centers, that's places to dance, that's playgrounds for kids. Because right now these platforms are pulling in billions and billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. Taking a small amount of that from disincentivizing the most severe addiction would change the way our communities worked.
That's fascinating. You said a sin tax. I heard sin tax, but it's
you
mean like
sin tax.
a sin tax like we apply to alcohol or tobacco. That's interesting. I've never thought about that. So everyone gets an hour a day on social media, and then after that, the company has to pay a 10% tax on the second hour and a 20% tax on the third hour and a 100% tax on everything beyond the third hour a day or something.
Because then platforms would come in there and say, hey, like, the thing that's most valuable to us now is you continuing to use the platform 6 months from now, right? You've shifted the focus away from optimizing for the pure short term and made it so that, if you really want to maximize the value of this user, retaining the user is now the most valuable thing. And when you look at how people churn off of these platforms, like, I had to go and start rereading through the documents that I brought out of Facebook recently, because I'm going to be participating in a lawsuit, like that we're trying to bring justice to some kids. And I've never had to testify before, like not in a court case. And so I'm sitting there rereading the documents. And one of the things that I was shocked by, and I was like, God, this just shows you how short-term thinking this organization is. They had a chart that showed if you were in the top tiers of consumption, like basically everyone else had the similar chance of still using the platform 6 months from now. But if you were in the top tiers of consumption, you got a real ding off that. Like, people could tell their lives were being harmed and they left. And right now, there's nothing that, they get evaluated on a quarter by quarter basis in terms of how much money they make. There's no incentive in there to be like, we need to actually pare it back a little bit now so that we can have more users in the future. But this would create that incentive.
It's totally logical. I mean, it makes sense. If a person drinks twice a week, then they're likelier to still be drinking in 6 months than if they get up in the morning and drink a bottle of vodka as soon as they get up. They're probably not going to be drinking, and like something's going to give, 6 months later.
Yeah.
Same, if you use cocaine once every 3 weeks, maybe you're still going to be using cocaine in 6 months. If you're using cocaine all day, every day, you're probably not going to be using it again in 6 months' time. Like, something's going to happen. That's really interesting.
Something's going to give.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. One way or another. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that interests me that your organization is doing is this idea of a simulated social network. What is that?
Oh, I want to do a simulated social network one day. We currently don't have the resources to do that. So
how would it work?
Just focused in on standard of care.
Explain the idea.
So to give you a little bit of context. So when we teach physics, people think, sciences are objective, like there's one true truth. Like, when we teach physics to anyone except for like graduate students or like later years of being a physics major, we teach with these simplifications that are not real. We talk about spherical cows. We talk about springs that don't weigh anything, that never heat up no matter how much we move them, that move through a vacuum. We do simplifications, but those simplifications are still powerful enough that we build intuition. So, for example, in the case of that spring that has no weight, that never heats up, we still learn about the math that causes something to oscillate, right? It's really powerful. When it comes to social networks, we don't need to have social networks that are perfectly high fidelity to what we see in real life. We need to have ones that follow the general rules that we know of social software. And at this point in my life, I've worked on 4 social networks. I can tell you wholeheartedly, there are patterns that repeat over and over and over again. We can go in there and take a bunch of people, make little simulated people. They're not super complicated. They have simple interests. They're basically numbers. I wanted to use emojis. Be like, all content on here is just emojis. People have emoji interests. Make it really simple. But it allows you to then go in there and say, let's try out different ways of distributing content. We can simulate a little social graph of who's connected to whom. We can simulate how much you like each of these people. We can simulate how likely are you to seek attention, how likely are you to actually post. And we can go through and generate some of this, what's known as synthetic data, and make it such that you can teach a class where you can learn data science by going and looking at data that is very, very messy, very, very complicated, but it has fidelity for these generalized principles of social networks. And the reason why that's important... Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, you were just about to answer the question, which was, what is the utility of it?
So the reason why this is so important is, when I sit down with people and I say, there's other ways of making a social network safer other than choosing which ideas can or cannot be said, right? There's ways to safety that don't involve censorship. People look at me like I'm talking about how gravity is only optional, right? People are like, what do you mean? Like, there's no way we can make it better. But I'll give you an example. Like Arturo Bejar talked about the idea of for bullying, right? Bullying is a great example where AIs are not going to be able to understand what is bullying. They just don't. They can understand a few slurs. They can maybe understand a little bit of tone. But if you actually want to stop bullying, you would take down so much innocent content, it would make things really dysfunctional. But if you come in there and say, let's use this as a suggestion. We don't have to be right for suggestions. We can be wrong lots and lots of time. But if you come in there and just say, hey, people have said that content like this, when they receive it, it hurts their feelings. About 50% of kids don't send that message, right? The platform didn't decide what they could or couldn't say. That kid decided, am I going to actually, that gave them a moment of pause. Or, you were talking about this, should the algorithm be picking what content you receive or should other people? How does that play out? And we can actually do that if we have a simulation. We can teach people so they have intuition themselves and they can go out and build better social networks.
And is the simulation inhabited by bots for the purposes of the students and researchers being able to analyze it? Or is it, because I could also see the utility in having a simulation that is populated by some cohort of real users. They may be interns or researchers themselves, but in order to understand the group dynamics of the way that people respond to different incentives, different algorithms, when you tweak this, given that the social media algorithms are essentially a black box and we don't really understand what they're prioritizing or how, couldn't you also set up your own social media networks, small scale sort of, scientific, I guess, A/B?
I think you would end up getting, I'll take a step back. So one of the most important data sets that has ever been made available for studying how humans actually relate to each other, how information flows within a company, is the Enron email database. So Enron was an energy company in the United States. They did some very naughty things. Like you'd say, how can an energy company kill people? People died in California because of how the power got shut off, how they made power surge in price, all kinds of things that were very, very illegal. But when they went bankrupt and, their executives went to jail, the company email database got released as an exhibit in the lawsuit, either in the bankruptcy or in the criminal proceedings. And so researchers can actually go in there and see genuine people who have genuine motivations in genuine relationships, in genuine contexts, and understand how they relate to each other. When you go and put a bunch of interns in a room and say, talk to each other, you might be able to get 20, right? It's one of these questions about scale. That when we look at the phenomena of social networks, we're talking about something known as a long tail effect. So long tail effect says, we often use the shorthand 99.1% rule. So that means 90% of people say nothing. They just consume. They just scroll, they read. 9% will do light actions. It's like a like comment. and 1% of people produce all the content. So even if I had 100 interns, I wouldn't really have a social network.
Well, to be fair, I was thinking more along the scale. I was thinking more along the scale of a drug trial where you'd have 1,000 people, 20 or 1,000. But sure, I mean, yes, you're right. You're not going to replicate perfectly 100 million people.
But even at the scale of like 5,000 people, right? Like you have the situation where the 5,000 people you recruit are going to be much more involved than real people are, right? Like when I talk to people about like where do the dangers lie or where the dangers come from, one of the first analyses I ran when I was at Facebook was we went and looked at, well, how is voice shared amongst people who participated on Facebook? So like voice is known as, so for example, like if I do a post and it is seen by 100 people, I have 1% the voice of someone who writes a post and is seen by 10,000 people. And when you go look at it, the United States came out as the most like little d democratic country in the world because about 14% of people made up 80% of the voice. Like there was actually a good number of voices there. Like 1 in 7 people made up 80% of the voice. When we looked at other countries around the world, 1 to 2% of people made up 80% of the voice. And my theory on that is that Facebook existed without algorithms for a long time in the United States, right? That meant when they started putting an algorithm in place, it knew about a lot of people. One of the biggest challenges when writing algorithmic systems, and we face this at Pinterest, was when you have a new voice, how do you know how much audience to give them? Right? It's really hard. And I think at the time that I was at Facebook, you had in other countries, because it rolled out so much later, like it got popular after there were algorithms, those only a very small number of people were there to bootstrap those systems. And they ended up getting much, much, much larger audiences.
Fascinating. So just to clarify, assume that you've got a simulation, it's populated with bots, and you're then kind of analyzing and studying it. What's the best case scenario in terms of what you would get out of this thing? Suppose we give it infinite funding.
I think the way I think of it is like right now, the way that there really aren't college classes around the United States on designing social networks. Like if we were to look at architecture, like how we design a space, like, a church is echoey. It makes you feel small, right? It motivates you to be quiet, or it motivates you to sing in unison with others because of how the space is designed. Versus a cafe is designed such that we can have conversations, that it encourages us to speak. Or like a club is loud so that we go and get close to each other and whisper to or like yell at each other, right? We spend so much time trying to figure out how to design our physical spaces to create the relationships and interactions that we want to spend our lives doing. You don't have schools of architecture for social media platforms. And imagine a world where you could sit down in class.
I just assumed that people in Silicon Valley are spending a lot of time analyzing precisely what shade of blue on the Facebook logo, makes people spend more time on site. I just assumed that the problem was that their incentives are all aligned simply to capturing my attention rather than making the space conducive to sane conversation.
So one of the challenges is that all these patterns that I'm talking about, because you don't, let's talk about SpaceX. If you show up at SpaceX to go build rockets, to go to Mars, you come in with at least 5 years of graduate education in some kind of aeronautical engineering that teaches you, like, this is what happens when a rocket fin is this shape, when you make the engine this shape. This is what happens when these two gases are combined. When people show up at Facebook, they show up blind. They start from zero. And one of the challenges is when I was at Facebook, the last of the people who really understood the whole system were leaving, right? Like these are the people who, because they'd been there at every step of the way, they knew where the bodies were buried. They knew what kind of worked, what didn't work. Like it was super fascinating for me getting to read the documents of these people because you could tell that the number of voices was diminishing and like the ability to actually have conversations with all the context, it was going away. And for context, like, places like Google go through these phases too. Like any large company, it gets more and more complicated over time, and you likely only work on a tiny slice. So you start from zero, you work on a tiny slice. It makes it really hard to have these larger interdisciplinary interaction conversations. Like, what do we actually want to build? Because there isn't a systematized way to even learn about it internally. And so what ends up happening is you do run the 50 Shades of Blue experiment. You don't run the what if we re-architected it in a really novel and different way experiment.
Right. Because nobody is the Richard Feynman to physics. Nobody is like a general practitioner in medicine. Nobody is like an all-purpose philosopher.
So Feynman is a great example. So for context for your listeners, Feynman was a physicist who became famous because he actually could explain to people how physics worked. He explained to them the beauty of the world that we live in with numbers. He got to launch into physics with probably an undergraduate physics degree, so 4 years, probably a PhD, 5 to 6 years. And then he got to spend 30 years becoming more and more, steeped in the beauty of the universe. I love social software. Like I've said this repeatedly, that if I could go work at Facebook again, if I could work at TikTok again, I would, because these systems shape our reality and it's just beautiful. Or like getting to watch people interact with each other at this scale. There's no social science data set in the world. The problem though is the vast majority of people who work at Facebook have been there for 2 years or less, right? Like when I left, my seniority in the company was like 75th percentile or something wild like that. And I'd been there for 2 years. And that's because in Silicon Valley, if you don't hop from company to company to company, you actually end up making substantially less money. Substantially less money. And so you have this challenge where people start from zero. They don't have a lot of context. They probably don't stick around for that long. And I want to add one more problem, which is we've said before, there's not one social network. There's many social networks. One of the things that was brought up in the recent antitrust trial, so just for context, again, for your listeners, at the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States has sued Meta. They're in the middle of a giant court case. It's really like soapy and like dramatic. Like they've interviewed Mark for multiple days, Sheryl Sandberg. Like it's chef's kiss, just fantastic. And the government's published a bunch of their exhibits. So you can like look through 100 pages of emails between these executives.
It's the Blake Lively court case for nerds.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. But you look at how they treated even Instagram after they bought it. They hoarded the technical talent for designing those algorithms in the main company. Like they intentionally understaffed it so that if it ever got spun off, it wouldn't have intellectual capital. You look at Pinterest. Pinterest had 300 million users and my team had maybe 15 people across the whole kind of like quantitative area, picking out all the content that everyone got to see in the world on Pinterest. And so it's one of these challenges of, we assume there is this infinite pipeline of talent, this pool of talent, but literally each one of these companies is reinventing things from scratch over and over and over again. And the idea that we could be so casual about designing the spaces that, the average kid in the United States spends like 3.5 hours a day online. Average. Right. So that means like the 75th percentile is probably like 5 hours. Right. The idea that we are so casual about the design of these spaces is something we really should think and ponder on.
How do you think about free speech, Frances? A lot of this gets framed around that sort of, I would call it a punchline, I suppose. Elon Musk bought Twitter ostensibly to reintroduce free speech to that platform. It's certainly a freer place to say certain kinds of things and a less free and less conducive place to say other kinds of things. When you and I were on television together in Australia, I felt like that was a moment when the conversation was, I guess, being portrayed in a fairly crude binary where I was like cast as the person who's supposedly really pro-free speech, which means that anything goes. And then other people are like, but hate speech, and the Australian government is like, we need to impose laws to decide what people can say. How did
that go? Did you guys actually end up passing?
No,
that's some questionable laws that you were thinking about.
That law, which was not as bad as ultimately I did a lot of reporting on that I hadn't done prior to our appearance together, and it was not as bad as it seemed to be. It was not going to allow the Australian government to police what people could say, but it was going to allow the Australian government to punish American tech companies that failed to report on how they were moderating what Australians say, which was perceived as being a sloppy backdoor way. But it was really about transparency of algorithms. It was mostly about trying to compel. It was a dog's breakfast of a law, as we would say. It was a hodgepodge. It was ultimately killed in the Senate, so it passed the House of Representatives. A few independent senators and some Greens, I believe, shot it down. So that probably puts an end to that level of reform. Nonetheless, it strikes me that you have like a much more nuanced and kind of third way of thinking about this than to see it as a battle between a free-for-all and, censorship.
So we talked about before this idea of power laws, right? So a power law, the 90, just watch, 9% toggle things, do a like, do a comment, 1% create the content. Even within that 1%, it again follows another power law. So the vast majority of people in that 1% post maybe once a week, once a month. A much smaller fraction post every day or maybe multiple times a day. And the thing that I think is really unfortunate about how we have kind of, it comes again, like, we said before, we don't have a good popular understanding of what's even possible or what's available to us. Because we don't have access to the idea that there are a bunch of different levers you can pull. The thing people come to first is, why don't we just take the bad thing down? And we spent a while earlier talking about the idea that like AIs don't know what we're talking about. Like they can't figure out gradations. They don't understand jokes. They don't understand implicate like when you imply something. Like if you actually want to remove the bad things, you're going to take down lots and lots and lots and lots of good things. Like that is not a realistic path forward. But what is a realistic path forward is to say, who is pushing ideas? And one of the things that I think has been really obvious in the United States recently, I don't know if this bled over into Australia, but in the last week or so, there has been these viral videos across a bunch of different social platforms of Chinese factory people exposing Western companies for like how they make things. And they all came out of nowhere and they're everywhere all at once. And when you look at these things, you have to take a step back and say, how did this happen? And the reality is there's a lot of people out there that are trying to manipulate how the algorithms function. Like we can take for granted the idea that people say hateful things. We have to take one step back and say, why is it some hateful things seem to go everywhere and other hateful things don't go everywhere? Like it's not a random set of things. One of the things that we saw during the referendum you guys had around Aboriginal rights was there were transparency folks that were actively monitoring that situation. And a huge fraction of the loudest voices that were happening who were pushing narratives in Australia, they didn't live in Australia. They lived in the south of the United States, right? Or there was a giant, probably the largest social media facilitated genocide to date. It's about 500,000 people died in Ethiopia a couple of years ago. Probably never heard of it. 500,000 people died. That wasn't even run by a state. It was run by a bunch of people who left Ethiopia, who were living abroad, who didn't like the ruling ethnic group and just started slamming them continually online. So where am I going with all this? Computers are good at detecting behavior. They're bad at understanding meaning. So what is that? Again, let's unpack that again. If I see that you are not a real person, you don't have friends, you don't message back and forth with people, you don't send emojis to these friends, they don't send stuff back to you. Like you are not a person, but you seem to be talking a huge amount and pushing out stuff. We have to ask questions about, is that how we want our platforms to work? What are the obligations of companies to watch for when people manipulate platforms? Because if we just did a better job at that one thing of going in there and saying, hey, if you're coming in here to distort the platform intentionally, we're just turning you down. You better be really, really, really compelling because we're going to like turn the volume down a little bit. It would completely change the tone.
Why not
because right now,
completely? Why not make social media platforms only for human beings?
Sure. I love that too. Like I think I'm saying there's a broad continuum here of things that we could step in and say, we see that there are foreign actors. We see that there's interference. Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, you have obligations to tell us exactly what level of investment you're putting into these things. Because like one of the things that I documented when I was there was I worked within threat intelligence. So there was a team that was doing this. They were looking at behavior, they were looking at content, they were looking specifically for people weaponizing the platform for influence operations. And I was in the sister team that looked at, ironically, counter-espionage. So this is things like foreign actors intentionally sending malware to you because you're part of a dissident ethnic group, say the Uyghurs, and you're living in Bangkok. And I know if I can get you to click on this malware, I can see all your photos. I can figure out where all you hang out. I can see your geolocation, like blah, 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 right? We went and looked for the people who were doing that, right? The thing I saw across all of those teams, the people who were searching for the child predators, looking for the people who were doing scams, looking for the people who were facilitating the growth of drug cartels and terrorists, was if they had a tiny amount of more help, like we're talking like 5 engineers, 10 engineers, we would have taken 80% of the problem off the platform. And we intentionally didn't get that. And so there's things where you could imagine passing a law saying, hey, you have to disclose the size of these teams. You have to let us directly pull them for whether or not they feel adequately supported, right? Like there's things like this where we could go and set in place systems of incentives where we could say, you can't let people abuse your systems,
right?
Because it steals the opportunity from real people to talk to each other.
So there's overt abuse like that, the installation of malware, hoodwinking people. There's the case of bots just flooding the zone with hostile nonsense. What about the edge cases that are the ones that seem to become the most controversial? I mean, this came up during the Australian attempt at legislation where there were provisions about holding social media platforms accountable for misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and things like that. Let's exclude bots for a moment, just talk about human beings, right? So one of the things that, people like me who are regarded as being on the free speech side of things in Australia would say, well, what exactly constitutes misinformation? What constitutes hate speech?
It's why the computers can't do it.
If I say that we should have been talking years ago about the integration of Muslim migrants in the United Kingdom, is that a form of hate speech and xenophobia and Islamophobia, or is it a legitimate part of the national conversation? And the government would come back, the Safety Commissioner, and say things like, there are clear-cut cases of speech that we want to ban on social media. For example, telling people that the polling place that they were going to go to on election day is closed. Or, that to me strikes me as, yes, despite my free speech bona fides, I would be happy to ban someone from posting that my local polling place is closed when it's not, because that strikes me as election interference. Do you have any insight into how we deal with those edge cases? Does AI provide any prospect of assisting us in making those adjudications? How do we manage misinformation and disinformation when we all live online?
So I think there's there's always exceptions that prove the rule. So I'll give you an example. Child abuse material. Like child abuse material, so this is people taking inappropriate photos of kids, putting them online. That's one of the great examples of where content moderation actually works pretty well. Like, because we have been fighting porn in general for the last, 30 years? Like, we've been trying to take porn off of public spaces since we had an internet. Because we have been detecting pornography for so long and we can find kids, we're pretty good at finding child abuse material and just not allowing that to be distributed. And we're okay when the computer is wrong. That's like one of these exceptions that prove the rule. I think there is a world where you could go through and enumerate publicly and say very, very cleanly, election interference. That is a thing that interferes with our ability to have a democracy. Here are the specific examples of things that are not okay. Or you have to give us a feed of content that you think is election related in the weeks leading up to the election. And in a public way that can be adjudicated, using these criteria, we can say what kinds of memes are things that need to be taken down. That's the thing that you can do with relative precision. But you can't do a blanket category, like say you can't have hateful content, because what does that mean? Or you can't come in there and say you can't have misinformation. The reality is those influence campaigns, that foreign interference I talked about before, they don't even care if stuff's false. They care if it's divisive. You can have true facts that manipulate people. And if you go out there and intentionally find the wedges to divide society, you can have serious, serious consequences. So it's more of a question around how are our systems designed? What are the incentives to get better systems? And how are we able to hold platforms accountable to move in that direction?
Frances, from your lips to God's ears, it's great to talk to you at last. Thanks so much for being on the show. It's fascinating.
Happy to be here.